Chapter 1. The Widow's Request. The sun had long dipped below the horizon, painting the dusty plains of Dry Creek with streaks of red and gold. The air hung thick with the scent of sagebrush and the distant sound of coyotes howling in the hills. The creaking of old wooden boards underfoot echoed to the quiet night, and the low murmur of voices from the saloon floated on the breeze. Inside, the dim glow of oil lamps flickered, casting long shadows against the walls of the small town's only watering hole. Jesse Montgomery sat at the far corner of the saloon, nursing a half-empty whiskey glass. He wasn't much for the rowdy company, nor the gossip of men who'd never known a day of hard work in their lives. His rough hands, calloused from years of tending to the land, gripped the glass tightly as he stared into the amber liquid, his thoughts far from clinking glasses and the laugh of a woman who'd already had too much to drink. A soft creak of the door caused him to look up, and there she was, Claire Lawson, the widow, her tall, lean frame silhouetted against the fading light as she stepped inside. The door swung shut behind her, and the noise of the saloon seemed to hush in her presence, as if even the walls held their breath. She was always the picture of quiet strength, but tonight there was something different about her, something desperate in the way she moved, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her shoulders. She spotted him immediately, her blue eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. Jesse shifted uncomfortably in his seat, not sure what to expect. She'd been a widow for nearly 2 years now, and though she ran the ranch just fine, there was an unspoken tension between them that neither dared to address. She walked towards him with measured steps, the soft swish of her skirts brushing against the wooden floor, her boots making little sound as they struck the creaking boards. As she reached the table, she stopped, folding her arms across her chest. "Evening, Jesse," she said, her voice steady but cool, like the wind before a storm. Jesse nodded, pushing the whiskey glass aside and standing up. "Evening, Mrs. Lawson. What brings you out this way?" There was a long pause, Claire's lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze unwavering. Finally, she spoke, her words direct, like a gunshot in the quiet room. "I need a man who can plant a seed of an heir deep and steady," she said, her eyes never leaving his. The words hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. Jesse froze, his mind struggling to catch up. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He shifted his weight from one boot to the other, feeling the sweat bead on the back of his neck. "I'm not asking for love, Jesse," she continued, her voice low but firm. "I need someone to help me carry on what my husband left behind. The land, the cattle, the ranch. Without an heir, it's all for nothing." The weight of her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Jesse's gaze flickered to her hand, where the simple gold band still rested on her finger, though it had been years since her husband's death. She was a woman who needed help, not just in the practical sense, but in a way he couldn't quite understand, a kind of raw, desperate hope that made his chest tighten. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. I can't give you what you need," he said, his voice rough. He couldn't understand why she'd come to him with such a request. He was no man for such a thing, not when his past had taught him the cruelty of promises broken. Claire's gaze softened slightly, but there was a quiet determination in her eyes. "I'm not asking for love, Jesse. Just someone who can stand beside me and build a future. I don't need a dream, just a steady hand to help me keep the land alive. You've worked the ranch, you know what it takes." Jesse lowered his gaze to the floor, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. The saloon chatter had picked back up, but it felt far away now. The world had narrowed to just the two of them, standing in the heart of a dusty room, a line drawn between them that neither could easily cross. Claire's voice softened, almost a whisper. "I need you, Jesse. Not just as a cowboy, but as someone who can help me carry on." His heart beat louder in his chest. He didn't know how to answer, didn't know if he even could, but he also knew that the quiet widow standing before him was asking for something far deeper than just a man to tend her land. The evening stretched on, the smell of whiskey and dust thick in the air, but Jesse Montgomery had no words left, only the silent understanding that had always been between them. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough. Chapter 2. Beneath the southern sun. The sun rose early over the dusty plains of Dry Creek, casting long shadows across the land as Jesse Montgomery saddled his horse with practiced ease. The air was already thick with the scent of sagebrush, and the distant mountains shimmered in the early morning heat. There was no escape from the dust, no relief from the endless sky that stretched out in every direction. But that was the life of a cowboy. It was simple, hard, and without promise, until the widow had come into his life with that offer he hadn't known how to refuse. He looked out across the ranch, the sprawling land that Claire Lawson had inherited, and saw the weight of responsibility that had settled on her shoulders. The ranch had been struggling, the cattle herd thinned out by harsh winters and poor weather. Without someone to help her, Claire would lose it all. He had known that for weeks, but he hadn't known how much he wanted to help until that night at the saloon when she'd spoken those words. "I need a man who can plant a seed of an heir deep and steady." Jesse shook his head as he tightened the cinch on his saddle. His hand lingered on the worn leather of the saddle horn, the realization settling deep in his chest. She needed him, not just as a ranch hand, but as someone who could carry the weight of her world, the weight of a future. With a sigh, he mounted the horse and set off across the dry plains, his thoughts tangled in uncertainty. It wasn't just the work that held him back. It was the risk. He wasn't the kind of man who could just step into another man's life, into a widow's world, and claim a place. His heart had been scarred too many times to believe in something like that. But there was something about Claire, something in her quiet strength that called to him. When he reached the ranch, Claire was already outside, standing tall beside the wooden fence, her silhouette framed by the rising sun. Her hair, a deep chestnut color, was pulled back into a loose braid, and the faintest hint of worry creased her brow as she watched the cattle grazing in the distance. She didn't hear him approach, and for a long moment, Jesse simply watched her, the way the wind played with the edges of her dress, the way the land stretched out in every direction, as far as the eye could see. She turned as he neared, a small but genuine smile crossing her face. "Morning, Jesse," she called, her voice like music in the quiet of the morning. "Morning, Mrs. Lawson," he replied, tipping his hat. "Need any help?" Claire didn't hesitate. "I could use a hand mending the fence over by the east pasture. Those damn cattle are starting to stray too far from the her." Late in the afternoon, when the sun had started to dip low in the sky and the world turned a soft golden hue, Claire stood at the edge of the ranch, looking out over the fields. Jesse approached slowly, the creak of his boots on the dry earth the only sound. "You've got it tough, Mrs. Lawson," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. She turned to face him, the breeze catching strands of her hair and blowing them across her face. She didn't answer immediately, but the look in her eyes said everything. The burden she carried was too much for one person, and Jesse knew, deep down, that he would do whatever it took to ease that weight, even if it meant sacrificing the part of himself that had always been alone. "I've had tougher days," she finally said, her smile small but genuine. "But it's nice to have help." Jesse nodded, his heart thudding in his chest. As the sun set behind the hills, casting the land in a soft amber glow, Jesse felt the weight of the moment press upon him. This wasn't just about the ranch. This wasn't just about helping a widow. It was about something deeper, something that neither of them could escape. With a final glance at Claire, Jesse turned toward the barn, his mind racing with questions he didn't know how to answer. The day was over, but the real work was just beginning. ChatGPT said, Chapter 3, Rodeo Nights and Reckless Hearts. The evening sun dipped low over Dry Creek, casting a fiery glow across the prairie that seemed to set the sky ablaze. The air was thick with the scent of dust and sagebrush, and the sounds of horses' hooves striking the earth echoed through the valley as the small town came to life. The saloon doors creaked open, and a gust of warm air swept through the town, carrying the faint hum of fiddles and the chatter of men eager for a night of whiskey and games. Jesse Montgomery stood in the shadows just outside the saloon, adjusting his hat as he surveyed the scene. It wasn't his kind of place. The noise, the heat of the day still lingering in the air, the raucous laughter of men more interested in drinking than anything else. But tonight, he couldn't resist. Something about the promise of a few hours of distraction, away from the ranch and the quiet tension that seemed to hang between him and Claire, had drawn him in. It had been 2 weeks since she had made a request, and though they had spent countless hours working side by side on the ranch, Their unspoken connection still lingered in the air like the dust kicked up by the wind. Jesse didn't know what to make of it. He had never been the kind of man to rush into anything. Least of all something as complicated as a woman like Claire Lawson. The sound of laughter from inside the saloon broke his thoughts, and he stepped forward, pulling the door open with a creak. The heat of the room hit him like a wave, but he pushed through, his boots clinking on the creaky floorboards as he made his way to the bar. He didn't need to look far. She was there, standing at the far end of the room with a glass of whiskey in her hand, her eyes scanning the room with a quiet intensity. Claire, she was out of place too proud for the scene, yet here she was, her posture stiff as if she were standing guard over the small patch of world she had left. The moment she saw him, her gaze shifted, locking with his. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved, the noise of the saloon fading into the background. Jesse's pulse quickened, the familiar rush of adrenaline making his heart race. Something about the way she looked at him, the mixture of desire, caution, and the uncertainty that seemed to hang between them, made the air around them electric. "Jesse," Claire said, her voice smooth, yet laced with an edge. "I didn't expect to see you here." Jesse tipped his hat, giving a slight smile. "I'm not much for crowds, but sometimes a man needs a drink." She raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a small, knowing smile. "Is that what you came for?" He felt a surge of heat in his chest. The air between them thickened, their past and their shared silence settling around them like a storm ready to break. "Maybe I came for something else." Her smile faltered for a split second, and Jesse saw the faintest flicker of something deeper in her eyes. Something he couldn't quite name. It was gone almost as quickly as it came, replaced by the cool, controlled woman he had come to know. But it didn't matter. He'd seen it, and it lingered in the pit of his stomach like a promise. A man with a rough face and a crooked grin sauntered up to Claire, his eyes sliding over her with a look that made Jesse's gut twist. He was drunk, stumbling on his feet, and Jesse's hand instinctively hovered over the handle of his gun. Claire, however, didn't flinch. She turned to the man with a cool, almost dismissive glance. "Not tonight, Hank," she said, her voice a soft command that brooked no argument. The man grinned, a lazy, leering smile that made Jesse's skin crawl. "Oh, I think you're just what I need, sweetheart." Before Jesse could step forward, Claire placed a hand on his chest. Gently but firmly, her gaze locking with his. She was still the widow, still the rancher who had learned to stand strong in the face of adversity. But there was something more in her eyes now, a challenge, an unspoken promise that neither of them could ignore. "I don't need your protection," Claire said quietly, the words for Jesse's ears alone. "I can handle him." Jesse's chest tightened at her words, a knot of frustration, and something else tightening around his heart. He didn't want to be the man who protected her. Not like this. He wasn't looking to be her knight in shining armor. But as he watched the drunken man reach for her arm, something inside him snapped. Without another word, Jesse stepped forward, the movement smooth and deliberate. He grabbed the man's wrist, his fingers like iron, and twisted away from Claire with a swift motion that left the man stumbling. "You heard the lady," Jesse said, his voice low but commanding. Hank staggered back, his face flushed with drunken anger. "What's your problem, cowboy?" Jesse stood tall, his jaw clenched. "You're making it mine." A tense silence followed. The noise in the saloon seemed to vanish, and every pair of eyes in the room was suddenly fixed on them. Claire's gaze flickered between Jesse and Hank, her expression unreadable. The drunkard glared at Jesse for a long moment, weighing the situation, but then he grunted, muttering a curse under his breath as he backed off. "Fine," Hank spat, "but don't think you've seen the last of me, cowboy." The saloon filled with murmurs as the man slunk away into the crowd. Jesse turned back to Claire, their eyes locking once more. The tension between them was palpable, a charge that neither could ignore. He stepped closer to her, his voice low, just for her. "You didn't need my protection," Jesse said, his voice rough with something that sounded like more than just frustration. "But I'll be damned if I stand by and watch a man touch you like that." Jesse's heart hammered in his chest as he stood there, the flicker of something deeper growing between them. The saloon's chatter and music faded once more, leaving only the sound of their breathing, heavy and full of unspoken emotion. He didn't know what it all meant, But as he stared into her eyes, he knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be worth it. For her. And as the sun set over the dusty town, Jesse Montgomery realized that this wasn't just about the ranch. This was about something far more complicated. Something he wasn't sure he was ready for, but something he could no longer walk away from. Chapter 4. Gunfire at Dusk. The ranch had been quiet all day, the kind of peaceful stillness that made the hard work seem worth it. Jesse Montgomery had spent the afternoon in the fields, repairing the barn's roof and checking the cattle. Claire had been out back, mending the fence line that stretched for miles. The heat of the day had settled into the earth, and as the sun began its descent behind the distant mountains, the sky turned a dusty orange, casting long shadows over the sprawling ranch. It was the kind of evening that promised serenity, but neither Claire nor Jesse knew that danger was about to rise on the horizon. As the last light of day faded and the stars began to emerge, Claire stood at the edge of the porch, staring out over the land, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the lanterns hanging nearby. Jesse, finishing up his work in the barn, wiped the sweat from his brow and moved to join her. There was a quiet tension between them, a lingering understanding that neither was willing to speak aloud. The bond between them had been slowly building, forged in the fires of hard work and silent longing, but was fragile, hanging by a thread that could easily snap. "Everything's quiet tonight," Jesse said, his voice low as he stood beside her. Claire nodded without looking at him, her gaze fixed on the distant hills. "Too quiet," she muttered, as if something in the air had unsettled her. Jesse looked out at the horizon, his instincts kicking in. It was almost too still. No rustle of coyotes in the distance, no movement of the horses in the pasture. He squinted, trying to see through the gathering darkness, but it was too late. The sound of hoofbeats broke the silence, rapid and heavy, coming fast from the north. His hand went instinctively to the revolver strapped to his side, the cold metal a reassuring weight against the skin. "They're coming," Jesse said, his voice tight with urgency. Claire's head snapped toward him, her face pale in the dim light. "Who?" Before he could answer, a group of men appeared on horseback, silhouetted against the darkening sky. Their faces were hidden under wide-brimmed hats, but their intent was clear. Bandits. The glint of rifles reflected in the fading light, and Jesse's heart tightened in his chest. There were at least 5 of them, riding hard toward the ranch. Claire stepped back, her hand gripping the porch railing, as she stared at the approaching riders. "They're after the cattle," she whispered. Jesse didn't need to hear her say it. He had already known. Without another word, he turned and ran for the barn, Claire following close behind. They reached the stables just as the first shots rang out in the distance, the echo of gunfire reverberating through the quiet night. Jesse grabbed the rifle off the wall, his fingers moving with practiced ease as he checked the chamber. Claire was already at the door of the barn, her eyes wide with fear, but her face set with determination. "You stay inside, Claire," Jesse said, his voice firm but tinged with concern. "It's too dangerous out there." Claire shook her head, stepping closer. "I won't hide while they steal what's mine." Jesse hesitated, his gaze meeting hers. There was something in her eyes, a fierceness, a strength that he could never deny. She wasn't just the widow of a rancher. She was a woman who had survived loss and hardship and still stood tall, unwilling to bow to anyone. "I'll protect you," Jesse said quietly, reaching out to touch her arm. His fingers brushed against her skin, sending a shock of heat through both of them. Claire's lips parted as if she wanted to protest, but the sound of horses approaching faster made her silent. She didn't fight him. Instead, she simply nodded, her face set in resolve. "Be careful, Jesse." He gave her one last glance before rushing out the barn doors, rifle in hand. The bandits were closing in, and Jesse knew they wouldn't hesitate to fire. As he stepped into the open, he crouched low, blending into the shadows of the barn, his eyes trained on the approaching riders. He counted them, each one getting closer. There were 5 men, their horses kicking up dust as they rode fast across the prairie, their eyes scanning the land. Jesse's hand tightened around the rifle. He knew he couldn't let them get any closer, couldn't let them take what Claire had worked so hard to protect. His finger was on the trigger when one of the men veered off, breaking from the group and riding straight toward the barn. Jesse didn't hesitate. He aimed, his heart pounding in his chest, and fired. The bullet hit the rider square in the chest, sending him tumbling from the saddle. The other men shouted, pulling their guns as they fanned out, searching for the shooter. Claire gasped from the doorway, her eyes wide as she saw the first rider fall. Jesse's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. The remaining bandits were circling, getting closer. Another shot rang out, this time from one of the bandits. Jesse ducked, feeling the breeze of the bullet pass just inches from his face. His body moved instinctively, rolling behind a pile of hay bales, rifle aimed steady. A second bandit fired again, but Jesse was already moving, his aim true, the rifle's report deafening in the stillness of the night. The sound of hooves came again, but this time it wasn't just the bandits. Claire had grabbed a rifle from the barn and was running toward him, her eyes wide with fear, but her hands steady. Jesse's heart pounded in his chest as he saw her approach, her figure a blur against the darkening sky. "You shouldn't be out here," he shouted, but she was already by his side, rifle raised and eyes focused on the remaining men. "I won't hide," she said, her voice steady, the fire in her eyes stronger than ever. "We fight together." Jesse could only nod as they both took aim, their shots ringing out in perfect unison. The remaining bandits hesitated for a moment, then turned their horses and fled into the night. The sound of gunfire faded, replaced by the distant howls of coyotes. Jesse lowered his rifle, his heart still racing. He glanced at Claire, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she stood beside him, her face flushed with adrenaline and fear. She didn't look like the woman who had once asked for his help. She looked like a fighter, someone who would do whatever it took to protect what was hers. Jesse didn't know what came next, but as he looked at her, standing strong and resolute, he knew that whatever it was, he wouldn't face it alone. With the ranch secured, the tension in the air slowly ebbed away. But the quiet that followed was not peaceful. It was only the calm before a storm that neither Jesse nor Claire was fully prepared for. Chapter 5. A New Dawn, a New Hope. The first light of dawn crept over the hills, painting the world in soft shades of pink and gold. The land, still thick with the shadows of night, seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The air was cool, the scent of sagebrush and earth mingling with the faint smoke from the smoldering remnants of the bonfire that had burned late into the night. Jesse Montgomery stood at the edge of the porch, his boots steady on the wooden boards, looking out over the vast expanse of the ranch. The fight had come and gone, but the tension still hung in the air, like the distant echoes of a storm long past. The ranch had been saved for now, but Jesse knew that peace in the Wild West was fleeting. Claire had nearly lost everything once, and now, as she stood beside him on the porch, her gaze fixed on the horizon, there was a new quiet between them, an understanding that hadn't been there before. Jesse felt it deep in his bones, a certainty that had grown over the past weeks. The connection between them, built on sweat, hard work, and the shared experience of protecting what mattered most, had forged something stronger than mere attraction. It was trust. It was respect. And as he stood next to her, watching the land stretch out before them, he realized it was something more. "You're quiet today," Claire said, breaking the silence, her voice soft but steady. Jesse glanced at her, his eyes catching the way the morning light danced on her hair, turning it into a golden halo. She looked different in the early light, less like the widow of a man she'd loved, and more like a woman who had found her own strength. She didn't wear her grief like a cloak anymore. Instead, she wore like armor, a shield forged in the fires of loss and survival. "I'm just thinking," he said, his voice low, "about the ranch, about everything that's happened." Claire didn't turn to look at him, but she nodded, as if she understood the weight of his words. "There's still a lot of work to do," she replied, the words coming out quieter than usual, as if she, too, was reflecting on the past few weeks. "The land's not done testing us yet." Jesse's hand rested on the railing, his fingers tracing the weatherwood, worn smooth by years of use. "It never is." He hesitated before speaking again. "But you've done a good job, Claire. You've held this place together through more than most folks could." Her lips curved into a small smile, but it was laced with something heavier, something she hadn't said aloud. "I've had help," she murmured, her eyes still focused on the distance. You've been more than just a hand on the ranch, Jesse. You've been something more. Jesse's pulse quickened at the words, though he could see she wasn't looking at him. There was a vulnerability in her voice that he hadn't expected, a crack in the armor she'd so carefully constructed over the years. It wasn't like Claire to leave things unsaid, and Jesse could feel the weight of her admission settling between them like a promise. "I don't know what you mean," he said, his voice hoarse, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Claire turned then, her eyes meeting his. There was no anger, no frustration, just a quiet understanding. "You know what I mean. You've been here. You've stood beside me, and you've shown me a kind of strength I never thought I'd see again. I don't need anything more than that." The words hung in the air like the fading remnants of a dream. Jesse's chest tightened, his mind racing to make sense of it all. There was no denying it. Everything between them had changed. In the heat of battle, in the moments of fear and vulnerability, something deeper had taken root. It wasn't just about saving the ranch anymore. It was about saving each other. A soft breeze stirred the air, and Jesse's eyes flickered to the distant hills. The sun was rising higher, the warmth creeping into the air, and for the first time in weeks, Jesse allowed himself to breathe. "I'm not the man I once was," Jesse said quietly, his voice rough with something he hadn't said to anyone in a long time. "I've been hurt, Claire. I've seen things that they change a man. I'm not sure I could ever be what you need." She stepped closer then, her presence calming and steady. "You're more than what you think you are, Jesse," she said, her voice firm. "More than just a cowboy, more than just a man who carries the scars. You've proven that time and time again." Her words were like a balm to his weary soul, a touch of tenderness that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He took a step toward her, his hand reaching for hers without thinking. The moment their fingers touched, the world around them seemed to stop, the wind pausing as if to hold its breath. Claire's eyes softened, the vulnerability in her gaze matching the longing that Jesse felt. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into him slightly, her heart beating in time with his. "I've never been good at promises," Jesse said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can promise you this, Claire. I won't leave you." She didn't answer right away, but the look in her eyes said more than words ever could. She took his hand, threading her fingers through his, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jesse allowed himself to believe in something bigger than a ranch, bigger than his own fears. The sun had risen fully now, the light spilling over the land, casting everything in a golden glow. It was a new day, a new beginning, and though the road ahead was uncertain, Jesse knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't face it alone. As they stood together on the porch, hands intertwined, the distant sound of the wind and the soft hum of the land filled the air. It was a beginning of something new, a future that neither of them had ever expected, but one they would build together, side by side. And for the first time, Jesse felt a warmth deep inside him, a seed of hope taking root where once only doubt had lived. Together, they would face whatever came next. ChatGPT said, Chapter 6, The Seed of Tomorrow. The days had stretched into weeks since that quiet moment on the porch, and the land around Dry Creek had begun to bloom once more. The ranch, once a barren patch of earth clinging to survival, now thrived under the careful stewardship of Jesse and Claire. The air was filled with the sweet scent of wildflowers and the sound of hooves as horses galloped freely in the fields. The cattle were growing strong, the fence line secure, and the crops in the west field had begun to show promise for the first time in years. It was late afternoon when Jesse found himself standing at the edge of the field, his boots digging into the soil as he looked out over the land. The sun hung low in the sky, painting the horizon in warm oranges and reds, a fiery contrast to the soft greens of the earth. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his muscles aching from a long day of labor. He had never worked harder in his life, but the satisfaction of seeing the land come to life again made it all worth it. Claire was on the porch, her silhouette framed by the setting sun, watching him with a quiet intensity. She had come a long way since the night she had told him she needed someone to plant a seed, someone who could help her carry on the legacy of her husband's ranch. They both had done their part, but it wasn't just the land that had begun to grow again. Something deeper, more fragile, had taken root between them, a connection neither of them had fully expected, but had quietly nurtured in the silence of their shared days. Jesse turned toward the house, wiping his hands on his jeans as he made his way back to the porch. Claire didn't say anything as he approached, but he could see the way she watched him, the way her eyes softened when their gazes met. There was no need for words anymore. What had started as a simple partnership had blossomed into something more, something neither of them could ignore. "Evening," Jesse said, his voice low as he stepped up onto the porch. Claire offered him a small smile, the kind that reached her eyes and softened the harsh lines of her face. "Evening. You've been out there all day. Want something to eat?" Jesse shook his head, though the thought of a warm meal made his stomach growl. "I'm good. Just need a minute." He leaned against the railing, his eyes drifting toward the distant hills. It had been a long time since he'd felt this kind of peace, since he'd allowed himself to believe that anything could stay steady, that anything could last. "Claire," Jesse began, his voice rough as he turned toward her. "I've been thinking." She raised an eyebrow, though she didn't look surprised. "About what?" He hesitated, the words coming slower than he wanted. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done, to speak his truth, to put himself out there in a way he never had before. But this was different. She was different. "I know I'm not the kind of man you thought you needed. I've never been good at making promises or living up to other people's expectations." Jesse's hand tightened around the worn wood of the railing. "But I don't need to be anything more than what I am right now." Claire's brow furrowed slightly, her eyes searching his face as if trying to read the words that hadn't been spoken. "You don't need to be anything more than who you are, Jesse," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I never needed you to be anyone else. Just you." The simple truth in her words hit him like a blow to the chest. He had spent so much of his life running from his own faults, too afraid to let anyone get close enough to see him for who he truly was. But Claire saw him. She saw through all the layers of guardedness, through all the walls he had built to keep people at a distance, and she accepted him, just as he was. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat thickening as the weight of her words settled deep inside him. There was no running anymore. There was only here with her, in the stillness of the evening. Without thinking, Jesse reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers in the softest of touches. She didn't pull away. Instead, she stepped closer, her eyes soft with understanding. "Claire, He stopped, unsure how to continue. His heart was racing now, the warmth of her touch sending a tremor through his body. But for the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to hide from it. He didn't need to protect himself from what was slowly unfolding between them. He had a place here, with her, and that was all he needed to know. Claire's gaze never left his, her eyes steady as she waited for him to find the words. "I never thought I'd find a place where I belonged," Jesse continued, his voice quieter now, vulnerable in a way he had never allowed himself to be. "But I think I found it, right here with you." Claire's hand tightened around his, and in that simple gesture, Jesse knew everything had changed. He wasn't the same man who had walked onto this ranch months ago. Neither was she. The land they had worked so hard to revive wasn't the only thing that had started to grow. Her voice was low, almost a whisper as she spoke. "I'm not asking for anything more, Jesse. I don't need promises. I just need you here with me, building something together." Jesse smiled, the weight of the past months lifting from his shoulders. The air between them felt charged, as if everything they'd been through, the danger, the uncertainty, the night spent in silence, had led them to this moment. "I'll be here," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "and I'll stay." Claire's smile was the softest thing Jesse had ever seen, and it warmed him from the inside out. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a future worth fighting for. Not just a ranch, not just land, but a family, a future, a place where he was no longer alone. They stood there in the quiet of the evening, their hands intertwined, as the sun dipped lower, casting the world in a soft golden glow. The ranch, the land, the cattle, it all seemed to hum with life, a living testament to the work they had put into it. But more than that, it was the symbol of what they had built together. And for Jesse Montgomery, that was enough. The seed of tomorrow had been planted, deep and steady in the future for once, seemed clear. The sun dipped low behind the distant hills, casting the wide expanse of dry creek in a fiery glow. The vast plain stretched endlessly under the rich orange sky, the wind carrying the scent of sagebrush and dust. The evening was still, save for the soft rustling of leaves and the distant, rhythmic clink of a horse's hooves as it walked slowly across the dirt. Above, the sky began to fade to deep purple, the first stars piercing the twilight. Jesse Montgomery stood at the edge of the porch, his boots steady on the wooden boards as he gazed out over the land. The ranch was alive in a way he never thought possible. Cattle roamed freely in the fields, the barn stood tall and proud, and the house behind him was filled with warmth and life. Claire stepped beside him, her presence a quiet strength. The years of toil, loss, and the shared hardship between them had forged something deeper than either of them had imagined. Her hand brushed his, and he turned to look at her. Her eyes were soft, but filled with something steady, something they had both built over time. "You were right," Claire whispered, her voice catching the dying light. "This place, it's ours now. Together." Jesse's heart tightened in his chest as he met her gaze. The dust of the land, the bloodshed, and the heartache had led them here, to this moment, to the promise they'd made to one another, without words. He pulled her close, his hand gently cupping her face as he whispered, "We built something worth fighting for, Claire, and I'll never let it go." The wind shifted, carrying the soft, distant hum of saloon music, blending with the sound of hooves. Together, they stood, watching the last light of day disappear into the horizon, knowing they had created a future where love, trust, and the land would always be their anchor. In the quiet of the Wild West, with the world around them still and endless, Jesse kissed her, a kiss that sealed the promise of a lifetime.